Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's always fun to be the bureaucrat from Ottawa following Louise. Everywhere I go, there's this little voice, "Hi, my name is Louise Binder." Anyway, she tells, it strikes terror into everyone's heart. So congratulations for making it here. I've just found out that one of my children has a snow day in Ottawa today, and the other one does not. So I'm extra thrilled to be here, so I don't have to listen to that. So I'm going to talk to you about what Health Canada does as a regulator, some of the initiatives we have going on, and fortunately, Louise has already explained a lot of the complexities, so I can skip a couple of my slides and go ahead, if I can get it work. So, Health Canada does a lot of things. I'm going to talk specifically just about our regulatory role. So, under the Food and Drugs Act, which is a separate legislation from the Canada Health Act, our job as the regulator is to make that decision about whether products can be sold in Canada. Are they safe? Do they work? Are they made with good enough quality that they can come onto the Canadian market and be made available? So this is a lot. We have about 14,000 prescription and non-prescription drugs which are on the market in Canada, and 36,000 medical devices the last time we did a count of. What our role is to look at all of the product life cycles. So we regulate clinical trials that are going to be conducted in Canada. We do that first approval, and then we have a system for monitoring drugs after they come on the market, making changes as needed with respect to safety, for ongoing inspection of manufacturing sites, recalls, and health warnings if there are any new issues that pop up. So this is my version of the slide that Louise just showed you, and now I don't need to go through it, so that's great. But it does show that there are all these layers, and they're very time-consuming. So it can take several years from the time Health Canada gets a drug submission to when it's actually on the market, paid for by a public drug plan, and available for everyone. And it's complicated. I will agree with that. So in 2017, Health Canada started looking at where we fit in all of this system when we started a project called the Regulatory Review of Drugs and Devices. This is usually known as R2D2, and I'm still thrilled to have business cards that say Director of R2D2. It's very fun. And what this was really looking at everything, all of the tools that we have as Health Canada have. What can we do with our regulations? What can we do with our policies? And what can we do with our processes to try to improve access to drugs? So this was funded through a big source of funding in Budget 2017. And that was about $70 million that came to Health Canada. That turned into a huge number of discrete projects, which I don't have the time to go through today, but the idea really was to look at some of these things with respect to how we can streamline access from the Health Canada perspective. And this work kind of fell into a couple of different buckets. The first was expanded collaboration with our health partners. So looking at where Health Canada fits into the system and seeing what we could do to bring some of those processes together, both with respect to the health technology assessment agencies, other players in the kind of healthcare chain, and also with working better with international regulators as well. The second piece was about more timely access, and that was about our own internal processes. How do we review drugs more efficiently? How do we do that more effectively? And take advantage of improvements that we can make to our own processes. The third piece was looking at data. There's a huge amount of information available in the healthcare system coming from electronic health records and other sorts of information. How can we use that data better? How can we supplement our normal, standard clinical trial information to make better regulatory decisions? So as I said, that started in 2017. It was kind of a 5-year initiative, so it's still ongoing, and you won't be able to read that, and I'm not sure I can read that, but I'll try to talk through it anyway. So where are we now? We have actually made a huge number of changes to our own operations. The first is, I will have to speak faster. First is about how we work, sharing work with other regulators. So we're all getting the same drug submissions. Rather than each country reviewing these drugs separately, how can we work together to share some of that work? We've created mechanisms where drug submissions can come into both us and to CADTH and INESA at the same time to try to compress some of these functions. And then we've built a lot of capacity so that as the drug submissions we receive continue to grow, we have the capacity to review not only the new drugs, but also cheaper generics and biosimilars to help support the healthcare system. But things are still changing. We have ever-evolving science. We have a lot of external pressures to continue to adapt to the changes in the products that are coming to us. So in this year's budget, there were a lot of changes made to the Food and Drugs Act to give us greater tools to be able to adapt to all of the new science. Some of the highlights here were the creation of an advanced therapies pathway that creates a way for products that are so unusual that they can't actually be addressed with our current classification of whether something is a drug or a medical device. This creates a specialized pathway where we can, for something that's new and groundbreaking, we can help define the regulatory requirements so that we're not constrained by the existing regulations, so that our regulations don't block products from coming to market. We're also going to be updating our clinical trial framework. The clinical trial framework is fairly structured right now, but the way trials are being conducted is changing. We have trials that where different arms are being added all the time on the basis of how people are doing in the trials. We have trials where we want to have the sites remotely, so patients don't have to come into a big clinical trial center every time. So updating our regulations will give us a bit more flexibility to be able to cope with new types of studies. So I did want to just touch on how we're trying to involve patients. We're trying to involve patients more and more in our expert advisory panels, so we're not just getting the view of the clinicians who are administering products, but also the perspectives of the patients who are actually using our products. Most recently, we've struck up a scientific advisory committee on health products for women. We're also, I'm happy to see you're going to have a big discussion about patient-recorded outcomes, so we see those a lot, and it's interesting information, it's evolving information, so how do we use that data about what's most important to patients to help support our decision-making? And we're also working internationally to try to make sure that all regulators are using patient input the same way. And I'll just leave this as a reference. So the Health Canada webpage is not super friendly, but there's an awful lot of really good information there about some of the things we're doing. So there are lists of the products that we currently have under review. There's information about the data that we've looked at and how we've made our decisions. And we're now releasing more and more information so that once we approve a drug, the clinical trial data is available for researchers, for patients, for people who want to actually dig into the details of how we've made a decision and what the science supporting that is. So with that, I will stop before I get my red sign. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Louise and Leah and team, for inviting me to take part in this event. I love this forum. It's always excellent and very challenging in terms of exposing us to so many new ideas. I've been asked to talk about the PMPRB, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, and the role of patients in particular. We were asked to consider specific questions about how patients can and should interact in this process. Just to introduce myself first, I should explain that I'm a former executive director of the PMPRB, but that's a long time ago. I was long-serving in that position for 15 years, but I've been out of it for almost 15 years, so it's a long time. But I still follow their activities, and Leah asked us to explain our perspective this morning, and I'll explain my perspective. I've always been pretty proud of the work that PMPRB has done over the years and its contribution, but it is going in new directions, and I've been quite explicit and vocal about concerns I have about those new directions. So we'll touch on that, so you have to know where I'm coming from on that. So some of this stuff to get us going, I'll go quickly because it's a bit tedious, but PMPRB is part of the Patent Act. It's part of the act that issues patents for new inventions. And it's a quasi-judicial tribunal. It's a court, in essence, a quasi-court, and makes decisions in a hearing on whether a price of a drug is too high or not. It falls within the Health Canada portfolio, but it's not part of Health Canada. It's independent. And its jurisdiction is limited to drugs that have current patents. So it has no jurisdiction over generic drugs or non-patented drugs. You may have seen a story in the Globe and Mail just a couple of weeks ago of a major new drug for a rare disease. It's not patented. There's no jurisdiction of PMPRB over the price of that drug. And finally, and I think this is the most important point, it's a regulator. It is not a payer. It does not fund any drug coverage in this country. It makes no decisions about what drugs will be covered or should be covered. It does not. It has a budget that's getting bigger every year, but it doesn't fund any drugs at all. So you don't go to the PMPRB if you're looking for coverage for a new drug, because they have no responsibility for that. So its mandate is pretty clear under the Act. It's basically a protection against abuse of monopoly power. So it's to ensure that patent holders do not abuse their patent monopoly by charging an excessive price. It also has a responsibility to report objectively on drug pricing trends and research and development trends in the industry. I need to stop for a minute on that word excessive, because you'll say, well, what is that? Well, the Act gives certain direction, and the board has interpreted that direction basically to say that for new breakthrough drugs, prices should not be higher than the median of prices in other major industrialized countries. And for all other new drugs, price cannot be higher than the most expensive existing drug on the market that treats the same disease. So for even today, I still hear people say, oh yeah, but these drug companies bring out drugs that they just tweak it and then they charge more than existing drugs. Well, they can't, and they haven't been able to do that for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean there may not be cheaper alternatives available, but there are drugs. They cannot charge more than drugs that are already on the market. So the legal framework is, again, a bit tedious but important. The board has remedial powers to actually, after a hearing, to order a price reduction, and these are enforceable in court. So these are very stringent and tough measures. As a result, proceedings in PMPRB become very legalistic. They take a long time. The normal period of time for a formal hearing is 3 years or more, and then there are appeals that go through the courts. So cases can take 5, 6 years or more before they're ultimately settled. So it's just to reinforce, this is a legal process. The board has relied on a voluntary compliance policy to avoid that process as much as possible by publishing guidelines that are pretty clear. You might take dispute with that, but the concepts are clear. And as a result, patentees are able to make decisions early on as to whether they're going to price within the guidelines or risk a challenge by PMPRB. And 9 times out of 10, they price within the guidelines. And then the PMPRB monitors to ensure that they maintain that over time. So, what are the mechanisms for patient engagement? There are no mechanisms for engagement on particular drug price reviews, no formal mechanisms. On policy, there is a very formal and very important mechanism, and that is that under the Act, consumer groups are identified as a stakeholder who have the opportunity to be involved in consultations, and the board has an obligation to consult with provincial ministers of health, consumer groups, and the pharmaceutical industry. So there is a very real engagement at that level. But patients can be involved at all times. That's how I got to know Louise, right? She came knocking on my door. Well, actually, I think she organized a protest down the street first. But that's how we got to know each other. I often point to Louise as an example of how patients can be engaged and provide useful input on an informal basis to the PMPRB in doing its work. She helped us be aware of what was coming down the pike in terms of some new treatments and where they would fit in therapy, and that really helped our work a lot. So I always encourage that. But if that doesn't work, you can also file a complaint. And more recently, the PMPRB has launched more investigations as a result of patient complaints than it has in the past. So how do you engage with PMPRB? Get on their radar. You don't have to organize a demonstration, but, well, maybe you do. Maybe you do. But get on their radar. Get to know them. Invite them out to talk, if they'll come. Engage in formal consultations. That's really important, and I encourage you to look at that very carefully. And think strategically about how you can help them. What can you do to help make their job easier and to help you get what you're looking for too. So we're in a period now of PMPRB reform, and this is the controversial part. And this is where I have personally parted ways with the directions in which PMPRB is going. As a result of a fair bit of work on their part over the last few years, the government has brought in new regulations just last August, towards the end of August, that gives the PMPRB new powers to consider pharmacoeconomics in doing their reviews, and to change the countries that are used for comparisons, introduce other factors, all with the design of lowering drug prices in Canada. So the objective may be a reasonable objective. The question is, are the ways of achieving that reasonable under the circumstances? When you consider that the PMPRB makes no decisions with respect to funding or listing, when you consider that we already have the very sophisticated, highly regarded pharmacoeconomic reviews by CADTH and INES, and that we have an effective price negotiation scheme through the PCPA, and Ashley is going to talk to us about what they're doing in a few minutes. So when we have all those things going on, what's the relevance of having PMPRB do this on top of it, especially since they're not part of PCPA, they're not part of CADTH, they don't work with those bodies. This is a totally separate federal body that's not related to funding decisions. So you've heard my spiel, but that's the point. So they began consulting a while ago now on how to operationalize the new regime. There were some patient reps involved in that process. Martine Elias is here somewhere. Sorry, oh, there she is. She was part of that. I'm sure she'll be happy to share her views about that with you. Durhan Wong-Rieger from CORD was also involved in that. Gail Atara from BMC. Various industry groups were here. CLIA, Karen Voyne, obviously manufacturers, and provincial territorial drug plans. And they produced this massive report, which I'll challenge you to have a look at it and see what you can conclude as to what that report actually concluded. Maybe others will want to speak to that. They're now moving into the second phase, and towards the end of next week or shortly the week after, they're going to release proposed guidelines to actually implement these new factors. And I think everyone's going to be looking very carefully at those guidelines. There'll be a period of probably 60 days to make a written submission. So I would encourage you to pay close attention to this in the next couple of weeks and consider making a submission on these guidelines. There will be public meetings of some kind or other. We don't know exactly when and what form yet, but there will be public meetings at some point to learn more. The design, the intent is that these changes will come into effect, will be finalized in the spring and come into effect next July 1. What are the concerns that patient groups have expressed to me? They're very concerned that these delays are so clear and uncertain that they will lead manufacturers to delay or even decide not to introduce major new drugs into this country. When I said earlier, this is very contentious. It's obviously extremely so, and the positions on various sides are are far apart and quite concerned. So I'm going to stop there. There'll be time for questions, and thanks for your attention.
Cool. Okay, so as they're pulling up my slides, so my name is Eric Sutherland. I'm with the Canadian Institute for Health Information. Many of you probably have no idea who we are. And I'm going to talk about data, which is probably one of the most dull, dry, boring topics that you've ever heard of, and your eyes are starting to roll back in your heads already. But thank you, Leah. But what I'm here to talk about is how data is actually the essential enabler of everything that we are doing, and what are some opportunities for the patient community to actually lean in and do some more work in that space. So first of all, who we are, Canadian Institute for Health Information. So we already heard about our prom dresses earlier on this morning. So we're the guys who actually collect all that patient-reported outcome measures, and now the new patient-reported experience measures, PREMs. So we collect them from across the country. We create reports to compare how different jurisdictions are doing in the country. And we also do comparisons internationally. There's actually a report last week from the OECD international countries globally reporting about how we're doing with respect to things like our patient-reported outcomes. And we fared reasonably well, but clearly some opportunities for improvement. Fundamentally, what we do as an organization is we provide the ability to compare how each other are doing in the country, to identify who are the positive outliers, who are doing particularly well, so others can say, hey, how can we learn from what they're doing in order to share that excellence across the country? That's what CIHI does. Now, my personal passion is really about how do we get data to be working more effectively. I love when Louise was talking about how convoluted our country is earlier on. The way that I frame it is that we are a country of 15 healthcare systems, and that's before we even talk about Indigenous populations. And so we are more akin to trying to get the European Union to work together than we are any one country. And at least the European Union has some unifying legislation that they actually follow. So we are an enormously complicated country, and we're just learning how to do this together more effectively. And I really think that the secret to a lot of this rests on the back of the data. A few years ago, The Economist published this article talking about how data is the world's most valuable resource. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, everyone, they're making their profits and their progress based on the backs of using data better than their competitors. They've caused massive amounts of disruption in various industries everywhere, which are both good and bad, usage of the data more effectively. And so why is it that this has suddenly reached a tipping point in the last few years? There are three main factors. Sorry, you might not be able to read that darn colors. I'll read it anyway. So on one side, we have data growth. The sheer amount of growth of data in the world has been incredible. Every 2 years, it has been doubling, and that has been consistent for the last 20 years, and it is expected to be consistent for the foreseeable future. When you look at indicators, my watch, my smartphone, think about the genome, the exome, and all the various bits of data and bits of information out there. If we take all the healthcare data in Canada, put it onto laptops, it would stack most of the way to the moon, which means, give it a few years, within the next decade, it's going to go all the way to the moon and back. It's an enormous amount of data and information that we have available. But data is useless unless it has context. So that's where we have the other cool thing that's happening, which is this emerging analytical capability. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, all sorts of fancy things, magical fairy dust, some people call it. I'll talk a bit more about to disambiguate the magical fairy dust in a couple of minutes, but that is the tool that's really allowing people to find deep insights in the data. But then, once I have the insights, what do I do about it? Well, fortunately, all of us have a computer in our pockets, or cell phones. We have the ability to actually get that information from the insights to individuals to actually affect change about how they're doing in their worlds. Now, these guys, Facebook, Amazon, they've disrupted virtually every industry except for healthcare. Healthcare has been enormously resilient. And but there are changes that are happening in Canada. I want to talk about three of them very quickly. First of all, we're moving much from a service-centric model to a citizen-centric model, which I much prefer that mode. We talk about these integrated Ontario health teams that are being created here. We talk about these integrated teams that are being created all over the country around a center, a person, and a lot of it is really in the interest of empowering the patient. But to empower the patient has to get access to the data in a way that they can use it and is meaningful. And so as you guys are sitting in various committees and talking about this, make sure that your voice is being heard. That I want my data to be meaningful to me so I can actually use it effectively in my own care and share it with the people with whom I choose. Because frankly, there are too many pockets of information out there that are not prizing the standardization of the data to actually make it in context for us. Second thing is we're moving from a world of zero risk to privacy-enabled access. And by zero risk, I mean, here's my little dirty secret. Many of us, when we go into hospitals and we think, okay, everyone's got my data about me, it's being shared amongst my health team, everyone knows everything about me. Heck no. I am sure we've all been in the situation, well, hopefully not, where you go into ER and you get interviewed 15 times as you go through the ER, talk about your health conditions. Why are we living in that world? Why is it not interconnected? It's because people are so worried about privacy. Oh, if I share that data with you, you might do something bad with it, so I'm not going to share. But really, bad things happen when you don't share. If I don't have Ebola, but if I had Ebola, you know, there's a public health risk of me having that. That information should be shared with my doctors and my family, friends, and I should be quarantined. That is a public health risk. There are things where the public interest outweighs the rights of the individual, which is actually something interesting. In the UK, we live and breathe by privacy by design in Ontario and in Canada. It's a Canadian construct, makes sense. But in the UK, they adopted a new principle, which is recognizing there is value in sharing data that can be as important as keeping it private, which is a health-specific principle. And all that it really means is it forces every access decision to be an ethics conversation. And so again, that's where from the role of the patients coming into this, really, what are the ethical constructs we should be building around this? How should we be thinking about it? Last thing I'll talk about is AI. So AI, magical fairy dust, oh my gosh, what is this thing? Okay, going to totally simplify it for you. Million monkeys, million keyboards, pounding out Hamlet. We've heard that analogy before, if you have that. All AI is a million monkeys surfing through a whole bunch of data, trying to find patterns in a very intelligent and sophisticated way, but really it's just about very sophisticated pattern finding using massive amounts of computing equipment in order to speed it up. That's really all AI is. But because it feels like it's one of those things that's for, you know, only the sophisticated people can think about it, it feels like this mysterious thing. One of the cool things that Finland did, darn. Okay, I have my, whatever. I have a little picture of Finland. There you go. So it's important, though, because what Finland did, they embarked to train 1% of their population on AI. And it is a publicly available, as in all of us, course online, 15 hours. Elements of AI. I talked to the originator of it yesterday. She's cool with me saying that. Now, it's in English, obviously. It's not quite as Canadian-based, but the whole idea of it is to improve the literacy, the data literacy, the analytic literacy of the population, so that way AI doesn't feel like this mysterious thing. It's like, oh, no, it's just a million monkeys working on keyboards. Okay, that makes sense to me. We want this thing because it will actually be able to provide better care, because I can surf through AI, I can surf through all the papers and find new treatments, new outcomes that can actually prevent diseases. One hospital in the US, they used their millions of patient records to lower their incidence of breast cancer by 25%, because they found a better treatment path that they could catch it in ahead of time. Similarly, you can use a whole bunch of data in order to find out what are the early markers of diabetes, and then through the computer in my pocket, you can send me what is a better health regime, what is a better exercise plan, so I can avoid the future onset of diabetes. That's the power of the things that AI can do. us understanding it and sharing that knowledge with our friends and our family and everyone, I think that is one of those transformative things that we can really transform our system. So in many ways, it's about how can we simplify the data regime, how can we enable the analytics. And if we do that with the patients at the center across all the different regimes of data and information, and really how the healthcare system works, we can create a better system for ourselves. And bluntly, I'm selfish. I want it better for me, my family, my wife, my daughter, and my grandkids, because this thing's got to be sustainable and effective going forward.
So the panel is now open for questions. Does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to share?
Good morning. I'm Zal Press. Wayne, really interested in something that you said, and I think it really could help people here. You mentioned that there was a complaint process with PMPRB. Could you give us an example of what a typical kind of complaint might be and how it might be resolved?
Yeah, was specifically referring to the last couple of notices of hearing that the PMPRB has started have referenced consumer complaints, and it's hard to know if the hearing resulted from the consumer complaint specifically, or if that was used as further support for a process that they were already going to do in any event. They don't rely on or require consumer complaints, but they can help answer questions people might have about the pricing of a drug and whether the price is considered to be non-excessive from their perspective or not. So I think it certainly is always worthwhile to get in touch with them and follow up with any questions that you have. But for the most part, the way the Act works is manufacturers are required to report to the board all the time. They have to report when they're about to introduce a new drug. They have to report their prices initially and every 6 months, prices to different classes of customer, prices in other countries for comparison purposes. So the obligation is really on manufacturers to report, and the PMPRB reviews that information against its guidelines.
Is this on? Sorry. Just a quick question for Megan. You mentioned that there is now at Health Canada a mechanism, a fast-track mechanism for things that don't fit within current definitions of either, I guess, a drug or a device. And I'm just wondering if you can give an example of what wouldn't fit within those two definitions.
Sure, I'm not actually sure it's going to be a fast-track mechanism, but it's a new pathway. So the idea is, we call it a regulatory sandbox. So right now, the requirements are if you're a drug, you come through, you have to have this much, all this data in your submission package, you have to have all your good manufacturing practices, that sort of thing. Most products can come through that pathway. We were able to authorize the CAR T-cell treatments through that. But we're getting a lot of questions about a number of cell therapies, things which actually AI in medical devices is one of the examples that people have been talking about a lot. So a system that requires you to come to Health Canada every time you want to make a change to a software doesn't work if the software is always evolving and learning. So being able to create some specific requirements that would allow things to come through that pathway would make it easier. Another example has been 3D printing of tissues, kind of at the bedside. So individualized, not centralized manufacturing. So how do you regulate something like that? Right now we regulate a product and have very specific coded in requirements for that, but maybe it's about regulating a process instead. So just creating a bit of flexibility to do that. So we haven't actually done it yet. We now have the opportunity. We're still trying to figure out what are the products that should go through that pathway, and it's really those that we absolutely can't regulate in any other way.
Hi, my name is Shnil Pathak. I'm a caregiver. I lived abroad and lived in Canada and experienced healthcare systems abroad as well. And so one thing I do is I compare Canada to other countries. And all three of you, like all three groups, offer very, very valuable services to Canadians. Now, I want to compare ourselves to Germany. We have 1,500 healthcare administrators. No, we have one healthcare administrator for 1,500 people in Canada. In Germany, it's around 15,000 people for every health administrator. What is each of your opinion of how we could reduce the bureaucratic system in order to be efficient like Germany?
Dive in. Well, Germans are known for their efficiency. I think that one of the things that, as we're shifting from this service-centric model to a citizen-centric model, there's an opportunity to really re-rationalize a lot of these organizations. It ties a bit to what Louise was talking about before, to really think about what are the needs of the Canadian healthcare landscape today that is different than what existed when the last 50 years, which has been a very service-centric, jurisdiction-based model. And so if we're moving to a more digitized solutions, more virtual care, it requires a fundamentally different set of capabilities from just coordination perspective. And so I think that rationalizing that in that context would actually be really helpful. But that really has to be led by, frankly, the Health Canada and the various provinces and territories. Is the complexity of the 15 healthcare systems fundamentally actually is partly what causes that administration.
I could perhaps just add that, picking up on Eric's point, yes, it's the complexity of having so many different health systems, as Louise described earlier on, that contributes to the problem. On the drug pricing and reimbursement side, I think there are solutions, because right now we have we have many different agencies, and with the PMPRB reform, we're going to have, in my view, overlap and duplication to an unprecedented degree, which will create a lot of market uncertainty. A simple solution in concept, difficult to achieve, is to bring all those processes together. And recently a federal report recommended creating a Canadian drug agency, and the federal government has committed to put some funding towards that in the last budget. A Canadian drug agency that could bring together the work of CADTH, the work of PCPA, the work of PMPRB, and put those into one agency. That would allow innovative approaches to funding new drugs, especially drugs for rare diseases, that would be based on pay-for-performance type agreements that we see in Europe, but we don't see here, and coverage with evidence development, et cetera. So we are missing out, I think, on innovation in our pricing and reimbursement system because of all this complexity. And instead of trying to address the complexity, we're just adding more layers to the system. So.
Yeah, and I would agree. I can't speak to the proposal for the Canadian Drug Agency, but I think the concept there is to have one group of people, to have one organization doing these functions rather than having duplication. So I think that would go a long way to creating some efficiencies.
Just a quick question. Would that include INES? Because you mentioned, like when you're talking about a Canadian advisory board, it would include Quebec, INES, or are we going to have two different advisory boards?
Well, the reality is that you'd still have two probably because Quebec has made it clear they will not be part of any national pharmacare plan or approaches to that. But that, in the long run, we're seeing a lot more cooperation between CADTH and INES and PCPA over time. I think that will build up over time. So once we get out of the jurisdictional hang-ups, logically these things will come together.
So thank you for all of your questions and comments. And if you had any unanswered question, please do write it down. Give it to me. I will get it over to the panelists right away so they can chat with you on the break. And thank you so much. That was really, really helpful and informative.